Okay, today we have Kimberly Jo Smith here with us, and I've heard her a couple times before, and we've been around a little bit, and I'm going to let her do a little bio about who she is, what she's doing, and also she's here today, and she's also here tomorrow. And so I'd like for her to talk about what we're doing today and what we're doing tomorrow. And without further ado, where's you want to do it? Thank you.
Good evening. Oh my gosh, it's really good to be back. We've been in North Carolina for a couple of years, and my son got married, and so we moved back to Missouri, and so we're glad to be close so we can come up and do these talks. My name is Kimberly Jo Smith. I'm a great-great-granddaughter of Joseph and Emma Smith through their son Alexander. His son was Arthur Marion Smith. My father is Joseph Frederick Smith, and that's how the line goes. And as Keith said, tonight is like the first of a series of firesides I'll be doing all summer that talk about the Smith family. And I'm going to start off with the Smith family in Missouri. That's going to be tonight, and then tomorrow is going to be Emma in the aftermath of the martyrdom and the rest of her life. And I believe that's at 4 o'clock as well tomorrow. And then throughout the summer, we'll get the dates posted soon, but I'll be talking about each of Joseph's siblings, how their lives went on after the martyrdom, and then his children. And then the very last one I'll do will be a little bit more about why Emma stayed in Nauvoo, and then my conversion story. So that's kind of the gist of what we're going to be doing. And tonight, the reason I picked that hymn, How Firm a Foundation, and I kept trying to sing it, but I kept trying to cry, and I didn't want to be up here blubbering at the very beginning of my presentation, but that song speaks so much of everything the saints went through in those early years, and just the kind of strength of faith that they had, and the kind of faith that we need in these times, in a time of chaos, when society and the world tends to muddy the waters, so that truth becomes indistinguishable from fiction. And so I love that song. It's a very faith-building song, but it really applies heavily to those early saints. And we all know the history of if you've done a lot of research or just even minor, or read the Saints, editions of the Saints, you kind of know the story of what happened between Kirtland, Missouri and Nauvoo, Illinois. And this is about my family, but you can imagine that each family that went on that journey experienced the same things, because they did. And it's more of an emotional look at what the Smith family went through during that time period. So it's more of a look at those dynamics of the family and how they handled these things than it is about historical accuracy. Not that I wasn't historically accurate, but I try to be, so don't fault me if you see something out of place. But I want the focus to be the dynamics of the family, what they experienced, the emotional toil, and the example of faith that they had to be able to go through all of these things and still have a firm enough testimony to keep going. And that's a testimony that we can look on today to help us. So I want to start with a look back to Kirtland. So that comes up right. I want to look at Kirtland because there's a lot that starts happening in those last years of the Kirtland time period, and then the saints coming out to Missouri. And I'm going to be reading several things because I tend to have a tangent of stopping and or a habit of stopping, going off in a tangent and taking 3 hours to do something I should do in one. So at the time when just before they left Kirtland, they were experiencing a growth in membership. They were building a temple, and there were marvelous revelations and manifestations that were coming forward. And nearly half the revelations in our Doctrine and Covenants were revealed there in Kirtland. Conversely, they were also suffering persecution, crippling apostasy, and terrible economic depression. So this is a time period that's got a lot of conflicting things going on while they're trying to build up their faith in this area. Early members of the church had a hard time grasping Joseph as a prophet. They had a hard time seeing him as a prophet role because he was so human. He was so much like them. History had conducted the perspective of a prophet, priest, or any church leader to be stoic, set apart from others, not on their level in any way. Joseph Smith was not anything like the biblical prophets that they imagined in their mind. Joseph, I'm quoting from Milton V. Bachman, Joseph did not have long flowing beard and did not wear a long robe. Instead, he looked like his contemporaries. While laboring in the fields, he wore the work clothes of his age. He played with his children, he wrestled with the strongest men in the community, and he joked with his friends. And he was a prankster, big time. That has passed down in the family, by the way. And so can you imagine when people come to meet this prophet that they've heard so much about, not only do they see him working in the fields and just, not being the staunch, prophet type person they have in their mind, and plus he jokes around with his friends a lot and pulls pranks. He was a man with imperfections, but he was also a prophet who recorded the Word of God, and some early members found this difficult to reconcile. So we have new memberships coming in with expectations, and then they're met with that. Now, during the early part of the Kirtland time period, you're dealing with a people who are very heavily bonded in trust and love with one another because society has rejected them. So once you come into that society of members of the church, it's a very strong bond. But when you get towards the end of the Kirtland period, you have these kind of things happening. Newer members are coming in. They have these expectations. The Kirtland bank failure was going on. People are thinking Joseph's not a prophet because that happened. So you have all of these doubts coming into the minds of the people. Early members of the church, which one come on? So did that one just now pop up?
Yes.
Well, that's mean. Okay. So we'll just go to the next one. Human nature versus spiritual authority. During some of the later troubles in Kirtland, like the Kirtland bank failure I mentioned, Joseph preached against pride and vanity and the many abominations he saw unfolding before them. But the building resentment continued to escalate when the bank failed. Many accused him of not being a true prophet. When some members had claimed to receive revelations about church affairs, Joseph had to inform them that he alone had the authority to receive such messages. Some early converts had difficulty accepting this restriction from a person who sometimes seemed so human and yet had spiritual authority over the church. So there again we have this building doubt because he's not what they expected. Does that sound familiar? Because if you go back far enough, there was a man named Jesus Christ who came, and he was the Messiah, but he wasn't what people expected. And because of the way he looked and the way he was, they didn't accept him as the Messiah. And here we are, thousands of years later, and there's still that mindset of getting those worldly habits of just thinking with those perspectives and not listening to the discerning spirit. So by the spring of 1837, many saints had traveled to Missouri and began settlements along Shoal Creek, where they founded a town called Far West. Upon leaving Kirtland, many saints had a bond of friendship and trust with Joseph, Emma, and other Smith family members. By the time Joseph and his family get to Missouri, they found some of those links of friendship and trust had been broken. At the time they left, Joseph III was 5, Frederick Granger Williams Smith was 18 months, and Julia, their adopted daughter, was 7 years old. So that gives you an idea where the family was at the time. This would be Emma's first time crossing the Mississippi River. Little did she know it would not be her last. This time she had 3 children, was expecting my great-grandfather, and had people with her to help. On January 1838, Joseph and Sidney Rigdon began their journey to Missouri, and their family soon catch up with them. It took 1 month to reach the Mississippi River at Quincy, Illinois. It took another month to reach Far West. Joseph Smith III would recall parts of that journey. He said, "Across the center of the covered wagon in which we rode, there was a division made up of fastening blankets. Father and someone else occupied the back of the wagon by turns. I remember we reached the river, which I now suppose was the Wabash in Indiana, and that the roads running through the lowlands were of a kind of called corduroy, logs laid crossways. Some who had been riding in the wagon walked over these roads, and I also did for a way, stepping over the ridge poles, holding on to the hand of my mother. John P. Bernard takes Joseph and his family to his home. George and Lucinda Harris had Joseph and his family stay with them until a house could be built for them. George and Lucinda Harris had Joseph and his family stay with them until their house was finished. Finally, they were safe in their new town of Far West. Unfortunately, Emma's joy would be short-lived. She would soon learn that the trials, persecutions, and contention that plagued them in Kirtland were beginning to surface there as well. So she's not there hardly any time at all, and I mean, the problems are starting again that she's been dealing with before. Joseph receives a revelation that Far West is a holy and consecrated land. It should be built up speedily by the gathering of the saints. Joseph sends a letter to the remaining saints in Kirtland that they have arrived. It said, "Dear and well-beloved brethren, through the grace and mercy of our God, after a long and tedious journey of 2 months and 1 day, I and my family arrived in the city of Far West, having been met at Huntsville, 120 miles from this, by brethren with teams and money to forward us on our journey. On our arrival in the city, we were greeted on every hand by the saints who bid us welcome." As I said earlier, the rest of Joseph's extended family left Kirtland January 1838. In his letter to Kirtland, Joseph announced that his brother arrived shortly after they did in good health. Samuel Smith left Kirtland in 1838. They had been stripped of most of their belongings by the time he left. He arrived in Missouri March 16, 1838, settled his family at Marrowbone in Daviess County in the spring of 1838. Joseph's remaining family leaves early in the spring of 1838. I want to reflect a little bit about their departure from Kirtland because it was pretty chaotic. Father Smith was arrested in Kirtland for performing marriages without a license. There were threats to arrest Don Carlos as well, but sympathetic dissenters allowed Father Smith to escape. Don Carlos relocates his father to New Portage, sneaks back into Kirtland, and organizes 7 families, including his own, plus 15 horses, 2 cows, and a collection of $75. They start their journey to Missouri May 7, 1838. Those traveling under the care of Don Carlos Smith include Father and Mother Smith, his wife and 2-week-old child, sisters Lucy, Sophronia, Catherine, and their families, and his brother William and his family. And Don Carlos at the time is in his early 20s. You know, when I was researching a lot of this stuff and seeing what some of these early saints did, I really noted their age and tried to compare them to people their age these days. And could they be able to do something that monumental? And it was pretty surprising how young some of these people were that had that much responsibility on them. Those traveling under the care of Don Carlos Smith, I already said that, sorry. On the route they traveled, May could be anything in regards to weather. And I woke up this morning getting ready to go to Adirondack Island, and I hadn't brought anything warm. I had a pair of pants. And I thought, I forgot that early May and May itself could be like anything. So I had to borrow a sweater from Chris where we were staying. But it could be anything in regards to weather, from pleasant to bitter cold. It was the latter for this party. Lucy Mack Smith would later write, "Sometimes we lay in our tents through the driving storms. Other times we were traveling through marshes and quagmires. One night we lay exposed to a rain which fell in torrents, so that when I arose in the morning I found my clothes perfectly saturated with rain. However, I could not mend the matter by a change of dress, for the rain was still rapidly falling." For 3 days they walked this way, with their wet clothes fully absorbed with water. Mother Smith would develop a severe cough, which would linger throughout the rest of their journey. They could only travel 4 miles a day as a result. While en route, Lucy's daughter, Catherine, gave birth to a son. Sophrony and her husband stayed with Catherine until her husband was able to send a wagon back for her. The rest pushed on to Huntsville for fear of Mother Smith's condition. Catherine and family arrive in Huntsville and meet up with family. Proceed to Far West, arriving in mid-July 1838. Mother Smith herself was adamant to make it there for one purpose, to get time alone in a secluded spot to pray. Once they settled to rest there, she found some time to herself, gathered 2 staffs, and walked to a thicket to pray for 3 hours. I heard someone else comment on something today when we were on a tour in Adirondack, and I think it was, oh my goodness, Brother Wilcock, are you here? Where was it we were, and you said that the gentleman went out into the woods to pray for several hours. Who was that?
It was at the Harrison Burgess cabin.
Yeah. So there was another example of who do you know that prays for 3 hours? Because I don't know anybody that does. And I thought, no wonder Heavenly Father spoke to these people and sent messengers, because they prayed long and they prayed hard. And here is this woman who is already sick, near death, and she gets staffs and walks out to the middle of a thicket to pray for 3 hours that she would recover her health, and her daughter Catherine would as well. Now, this isn't the only time Lucy Mack Smith has done this. When she was younger and she had a fever and she was on her deathbed, and she prayed very hard to Heavenly Father that if He would heal her, she would devote her life to His service. And she was healed and survived that. Catherine's family arrive in Huntsville, meet up with family, proceed to Far West. Father Smith's brother Silas was father to Jesse Nathaniel Smith. He left later in the summer with the Kirtland camp. Upon hearing of the extermination order when they were in Huntsville, Missouri, he went instead to Pittsfield, Illinois, and became a leader of the church there. He passed away there in 1839. The third member of the first presidency, Hiram Smith, did not leave Kirtland until March 1838, probably due to being recently married and settling his affairs. Those affairs included organizing the new church leadership in Kirtland after the departure of Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon. He also helped organize the Kirtland camp, the largest body of church immigrants ever to assemble to that time, and head to Missouri. This was the first removal company to be organized in church history. Things in Missouri looked promising, and the numbers of saints moving into that area would eventually necessitate the creation of a new county called Caldwell. By April 1838, Joseph gave instructions for Far West to be built up by the gathering of the saints, and stakes should be created in the outlying regions. Okay. In March of 1838, members of the Quorum of 70 met in Kirtland to discuss how to help the remaining saints get to Missouri. They left in July 1838 with high hopes, unaware that as they traveled, persecution was on the rise in Missouri. On June 2nd, 1838, my great-grandfather, Alexander Hale Smith, was born in Far West. He was Joseph and Emma's 5th son and 6th child. Joseph notes in his journal, "I returned from a surveying expedition, for I had a son born unto me." He was named after Alexander Donovan, who had helped Joseph so much, and Hale in honor of Emma's family name. John Smith was brother to Joseph Smith Sr. and father to Elias Smith. He arrives in Far West June 16, 1838, with 6 other families. One of the first to settle in what they called Diamond in June 26, 1838. On June 28, 1838, the stake is organized at Adirondack. John is made stake president. He would be forced to leave 4 months later. By the time the Kirtland camp arrived, they would only be there 6 weeks before they were driven out of Missouri. Okay, so here they've left Kirtland and the problems there. They've heard so much about this beautiful paradise and what they could make out of that for the church and build up the kingdom there. Go through that harsh travel and arrive, and within 6 weeks, they're driven out. And can you imagine how devastating That's why I love that song, How Firm a Foundation. When you consider everything they went through and just to get there and just starting to start over, and then here we go again. It's just, the whole study of it is amazing to me, because I like to reflect on it when things get hard here and now. And I always say to myself, if they could handle that and if they can do that, I can push through whatever I come up against here. Elias Smith is the son of Joseph's uncle Asel. He left with the Kirtland camp in July 1838 as one of the captains of the company. He defended Far West when under siege, was forced to give up weapons, on the committee to help move Latter-day Saints from Missouri to Illinois, and was among the last Mormons to leave Far West. By mid-July, Joseph welcomed the arrival of his extended family, including his parents. For the duration of the Missouri period, Joseph's sisters and their families would remain in Far West near their parents and Joseph and Emma. So let's look at Far West and kind of what it looked like. 5,000 people, 95% Latter-day Saints, 2 hotels, 1 boarding house, print shop, 6 blacksmith shops, grist mills and sawmills, and the temple site in the town center. And so this artistic rendering gives you an idea of what the town would have looked like with the temple square over there on the far left. It was built, the businesses face the public square, which is still the custom today in small towns. You'll go to a small, when we were living out west, we'd talk about going around the square, and people was like, what's a square? And we had to tell them, the small towns, they have a square where all the businesses are just centered around it. The temple site was located along County Road D and a gravel road on the south side of the square. Joseph and Hiram both had businesses there. Joseph owned the boarding house, which was run by his parents. And I'm going to show you where the different Smith family members settled. So William Smith settled about 20 miles from Far West. Samuel had settled in Marrowbone. Don Carlos settled on a farm in Davies County, 30 miles north of Far West. And John Smith settled in Adamon-Diamond. On August 1st, Samuel Harrison Smith is born to Samuel and his wife. So this gives you an idea of course, we have Joseph and Emma and their families there in Far West. So this gives you an idea how they were spread out. And as we drove from Adamon-Diamond back to Chris's near, what's the name of that town right by her? Is it Maryville? Yeah.
Just south,
Yeah. So just driving, when I think of the different times they had to flee different areas, and they were all coming back to Far West, and William was 20 miles away, and they were either on foot or horseback or in a horse with a buggy or a buckboard or whatever they had, and 9 times out of 10 it was in the winter time. So just the distance itself, that just blows my mind how they did that. I had a hard enough time getting back from Adamon-Diamond to Far West in time to get ready. So, on August 6th, violence erupted in Gallatin when Latter-day Saints were prohibited from voting. This led to inflammatory letters being circulated to neighboring towns by the mob in hopes of gathering support against the Mormons, one of which claimed that Joseph Smith killed 7 individuals himself. This roused already hot tempers of their enemies. So this leads me to a side story about Lucy Mack Smith, who I absolutely love. She has a polite feistiness. That's what I like to call it. Just feisty enough to let you know she's a very stalwart member of the church without being offensive. But one day she was, as I said earlier, they ran the boarding house for Joseph, and she was in there and doing chores, cleaning up and stuff, and the door was open. Joseph was there as well, writing letters, and Lucy looks out the door and across the way spots a unit of what she thought was the state militia practicing their drills. But before too long, 8 officers were on her doorsteps and then in her house. She offered them refreshments and to sit down and rest, but they refused, saying that they had not come to have a pleasant visit. They were there to kill Joe Smith and all of the Mormons, to which Lucy asked for what purpose did they want to kill Joe Smith. They replied that he had killed 7 men in Gallatin during the elections. Lucy promptly told them they were mistaken, for he was not even there on that day. They did not believe her, to which she replied, "I suppose you intend to kill me with the rest." "Yes, we do," he answered. "Very well, I want you to act the gentleman about it and do the job quick. Then I shall be at rest. But I should not like to be murdered by inches." This statement frustrated the officer. "There it is again. You tell a Mormon you will kill them, and they will always tell you it's nothing, that if you kill us, we'll be happy." By then, Joseph had finished his letter, made his way into the room, and introduced himself, asking them to give him a moment to explain what their purposes and beliefs were. By the end of the discussion, he had won their hearts, and they knew they had been lied to. When Joseph got up to go home, they sprang before him and offered to go with him, for it was too dangerous to go alone. Lucy recalled hearing their whispered remarks as they left about whether or not they all felt the powerful spirit that accompanied him as he shook their hands and he spoke to them. They promised to do all they could to help diffuse the growing tensions. And I just love that story. It wasn't the first time that she had to stand up to somebody. She had to do that a lot in Vermont and New York. So, pretty neat lady. For all her short height. I get to thank her for that short height. I think she was 4'9" is how tall she was. So by August, William and his family was brought to Far West due to illness so they could be tended. William has a vision of thousands of men coming to destroy Far West and the people in it. He tells Joseph Smith Sr. about it, but Joseph Smith Sr.'s reply to him is, "We will talk to Joseph. He will know what to do about the situation." William will not be fully recovered from his illness until mid-September. Amidst growing tensions, Samuel, fearing for his family's safety, goes west. Samuel is going for a carriage to get his family out. His wife Mary has just given birth to their son, Samuel Harrison. While he is gone, the mob attacks their cabin, leaving the new mother and her children on a mattress in the snow. Those of you who are missionaries here or have stayed here throughout the winter know how bitter the winters are. And she's just had a baby. A sympathetic neighbor gets them in a wagon, and a 15-year-old boy helped get them out of the area. Samuel runs into them en route to his home. His wife had traveled a day and night without any food and water. By the time Samuel got her to Far West to be tended by his mother, the little family had been exposed to the elements for 36 hours. With the help of family, Mary came around, but she would never fully recover. It was said that from that point, she barely spoke above a whisper. So we're starting to see the emotional toll on the family with everything that's going on, and the physical toll as well. Don Carlos, his cousin George Albert Smith, and others are sent to missions to the south and east to get funds, and this is to help purchase lands. And I think Brother Wilcocky was talking earlier about the preempt, how they were able to get their land. And this was one of the things that Don Carlos and George Albert Smith was charged with doing. They need enough money so they could purchase those lands, but while they're gone, they don't know that everything's falling apart. But I'm getting ahead of myself. See, this is why I read. So let's go to the next one. October 2nd, Kirtland Camp arrived safely at Far West. Church leaders directed the new arrivals to settle at Adamon-Diamond. They spent the night on the grounds surrounding the temple site, left the next day, and arrived on October 4th. Several wagons, which had broken off from the Kirtland Camp early in the journey, settled in areas such as Caldwell and Davies County, including a party of 11 wagons who made their way to Hans Mill under the leadership of Joseph Young. 2 days later, they would be attacked at Hans Mill. So they've just come in. They're only there 2 days, and the attack on Hans Mill happens. On October 12th, tensions had been growing in DeWitt between the locals and the Saints since August because they were rapidly buying up property and moving in. Just days before the Gallatin election, a committee was sent to DeWitt, and the Saints were ordered to leave the county by August 7th. But the Saints were determined to stay. A plan of expulsion was drawn up, and the county enlisted help of their neighbors for fear that the Mormons had had a force that would come against them. At the end of August, a team of raiders rode through DeWitt and ordered the Saints to leave within 10 days. In September, the town fell under a 3-week siege until the Saints were driven out. Even though they had followed the advice of General Donovan and followed the law to the letter, they were still persecuted and pushed out. On October 12th, Emma begins to see a trail of upwards of 70 wagons and a mass of people coming to Far West. These were the Saints who had been driven out of DeWitt. The land in front of the Smith family's home would be filled with the sick and destitute. Mother Smith, her daughters, Emma, and many other women began to see to their immediate care. Mother Smith said houses in Far West were so full that people could not find shelter. It was enough to make the heart ache to see the children sick with colds and crying around their mothers for food, whilst their parents were destitute of the means of making them comfortable. On October 18, just weeks after leaving for his mission, Don Carlos's wife, Agnes, was pushed out of her home with her little children. Agnes lived in fear of being attacked since the troubles in Missouri began. She slept with her children, did not undress so as to be on the ready if they needed to move fast. On this evening, her fears were realized as angry, drunken men burst through the door of her cabin, carried her out on a mattress, and deposited her there with her new babe and daughter Agnes in the cold winter night air. They had taken all of her household goods, burned the cabin, but she had escaped by the skin of my teeth, she said. She traveled in darkness, leaving footprints of blood in the snow that was over shoe-mouth deep to the Big Muddy Creek, a tributary of the Grand River, where she crossed waist-deep water. 2-year-old Agnes clung to her with legs wrapped around her neck, and 6-month-old Agnes was held, 6-month-old sister held snugly against her breast. They arrived at the cabin of Lyman White about an hour before midnight, having traveled over 3 miles in the snow in the middle of winter, crossing in a creek that was waist deep, and you know how cold that water was. On October 25th, while Don Carlos was gone on his mission, persecution continued to rise. The Saints had raised their own militia for defense. Upon hearing of troubles arising in the southern part of the county, Samuel went with several men to check things out. He took 60 to 75 men with him, and their arrival would escalate in what would become known as the Battle of Crooked River. Mother Smith's grandson, Arthur Milliken, son of Lucy Smith Milliken, was a drummer boy in the militia, and he was shot above each knee. Benjamin F. Johnson got him to safety, and they fled to Fort Kearny, Kansas, eventually going to Illinois to join their families after the Missouri Exodus. Samuel's enemies made a special effort to seek out those saints who were at Crooked River that day, compelling Samuel to escape to the wilderness with many other men. They ran into heavy snow and was without food for some time. Samuel recalled being led by the Spirit in a certain direction, which took him and Charles C. Rich to an Indian camp, where a woman made bread for them and gave them dried meat. This would sustain them for some time. They arrived 14 days later in Illinois. October 27th, the extermination order is issued, and violence increases at the time. Perhaps 10,000 Mormons were concentrated in 2 particular counties. Their chief settlement was Far West in Caldwell County. Far West had a population by then of about 5,000 saints, and another 5,000 lived in at least 19 other Latter-day Saint communities in Caldwell County. October 30th, we have Hans Mill. Joseph and Hiram Smith are arrested on October 31st. On November 1st, church leaders tell Charles C. Rich to flee north into the wilderness and take all that they can to find the brethren that was in the Crooked River battle. They took the shortest way out of the state, 60 to 80 miles into unsettled areas of Iowa. Samuel Smith was one of those who went with him. The wives of these men were left behind to fend for themselves or rely on the help of others. There were many women who faced unbelievable challenges. I think that this time period in Missouri for the women is what tried them and solidified them to be able to be Relief Society sisters, to be able to go through the things that they did and come out of it with the strength that they did. I think that's what built them up for the time when the Relief Society was organized and that they had to come forward and when things got bad and serve I just go back and look at what each of the sisters went through, and not just my family. There's so many stories out there. If you don't know some of the pioneer stories, you can look them up online, of these amazing stories of these women that had to go through what they did while their husbands were either in hiding or in jail. On November 2nd, having been arrested, Joseph, Hiram, and other prisoners are brought into Far West to bid their families goodbye and collect personal belongings. Mary Fielding Smith gave birth to her son Joseph F. on November 13, 1838. She would make a brief visit in January to her husband. Emma Smith writes to her husband, this is where she writes the letter to him. It says, "The walls, bars, and bolts, rolling rivers, running streams, rising hills and sinking valleys, spreading prairies that separate us, and the cruel injustice that first cast you into prison and still holds you there, with many other considerations, places my feelings beyond description. No one but God knows the reflections of my mind and the feelings of my heart when I left our house and home and almost all of everything that we possessed, excepting our little children, and took my journey out of the state of Missouri, leaving you shut up in that lonesome prison. But the reflection is more than human nature ought to bear. And if God does not record our sufferings and avenge our wrongs on them that are guilty, I shall be sadly mistaken." Despite how this injustice weighed on her, Emma could still say to Joseph, quote, "I shall live and am yet willing to suffer more, if it is the will of kind heaven that I should for your sake." Throughout November, Emma's home was ransacked on more than one occasion. They took all of their bedding, and when Joseph wrote to her in dire need of blankets due to the freezing conditions, she wept, for she had none to send but what her little ones had. Several sisters said to send it anyway, and they would get her more. The whole of the Smith family were in survival mode. Don Carlos was still en route home. His wife Agnes and children were safe for the time being at Adam-on-Diamond. Samuel was unable to come back to Missouri, and he was making his way to Illinois. John was at Adam-on-Diamond, and the rest of the family were at Far West. Toward the end of November 1838, William reminds his father of the vision he had, and that there were indeed thousands coming to push them out. He tries to talk to Father Smith and have him leave, but he would not consider it unless it came through Joseph by revelation. William would not wait and left Missouri in November, relocating to Plymouth, Illinois, 30 miles south of Nauvoo. He sends a team back to Far West, should the family have need of it. William was still bitter about his losses in Ohio, and now he has lost everything in Missouri. One horse, a horse and buggy, 160 acres of land in Daviess County, 20 acres in Caldwell County, some of which he had paid for in gold. He had only been in Far West a couple of months before things began to turn against them. Father Smith wrote to Joseph about the matter while his sons were imprisoned. Joseph directed them to leave Missouri. They do their best to prepare for another long journey in the midst of winter with little means to assist them. Don Carlos and George A. were nearly home when they were discovered by their enemies, forcing them to travel 100 miles in 2 days and 2 nights, pushing hard into a severe northwest wind that battered their faces. They had little to eat and nearly froze to death. Don Carlos arrived in Far West on Christmas Day to the chaos that had been unleashed since he left Missouri. Finding his family is safe, he focuses on getting all of them out of Missouri. Once again, Don Carlos will lead his family to a place of safety. I have to share a little side story here about Don Carlos's return from the mission they were sent to in the South and coming back. As they're at one point at the Mississippi and they're getting ready to cross, he hears a lot of footsteps in the distance, and he looks down, and there's this thousands of people who are walking and crossing the river, and he reflected how destitute they all looked, and it was the Cherokee on the Trail of Tears. And I was like, oh my gosh. At the time he's seeing all this, his bowels are just filled with compassion for these people and how destitute they look, and he doesn't even know the same thing's happening to his own family in Missouri. And I thought that was an interesting thing to read about. Okay. Elias and John Smith, Joseph's uncles, were called to be on a committee to help the poor leave Missouri. From January to the spring of 1839, between 12 and 15,000 saints made their way from Missouri to Illinois by wagon or on foot. In February, Joseph Smith's parents tried to leave early, but Lucy said, "Just as we got our goods into the wagon, a man came to us and said that Sidney Rignan's family were ready to start and must have the wagon immediately. Accordingly, our goods were taken out. They waited until another team came for them. We put our goods into the wagon a second time, but the wagon was wanted for Emma and her family, so our goods were again taken out." Stephen Markham was on the committee of removal, and he assisted Emma Smith in leaving on February 7th. Emma gathered what little she had, and with the assistance loaded it and her children into a wagon. James Mulholland had taken the inspired translation documents to his sister, who sewed them up in a muslin pocket apron, which Emma in turn sewed into the skirts of her dress. She traveled 9 days through the rain and sleet, arrived at the frozen Mississippi nearly 1 year from the time she had crossed it before. This time it was different. She was basically alone with her little children crossing a frozen Mississippi. Walking apart from the wagon for safety, she crossed with her 2 older children clung to her skirts. She held little Freddie and her infant, my great-grandfather Alexander. At times, the winds in this area of the Midwest by the river in February, temperature can reach 30 below zero. Stephen Markham delivered her and her children safely in Quincy. Emma Smith and the children arrived February 15th. They moved in with Judge John Cleveland and his Latter-day Saint wife, Sarah. 4 miles east of Quincy, Sarah later became Emma's first counselor in the Nauvoo Relief Society. On February 19th, Joseph Smith's parents, Joseph Sr. and Lucy, finally joined the Exodus. After a long time, Mother Smith said, we succeeded in getting one single wagon to convey beds, clothing, and provisions for our family, and luggage. Don Carlos, with his family and the remainder of his baggage, was crowded into a buggy and went in the same company with us. On the 5th day of their journey to Missouri, Don Carlos approached a farmhouse to seek help for his ailing father. The weather was extreme, and he feared his father would not make the journey if they continued on. The man who answered the door was an Esquire man, who took pity on the impoverished travelers, giving them a place to sleep, food, and warmth. The next morning they continued, having better provisions, but the weather worsened with rain, sleet, and mud. And here they are again on a journey that's just absolutely horrible. Mother Smith said that their shoes would sink into the mud ankle deep. When they reached the Mississippi, they had no choice but to sleep on the snow, there being no ferry for them. Samuel, upon hearing where they were, had a ferry sent for them the next day. They arrived in Quincy, where Samuel had rented a house, and they moved in with 4 other families. Joseph Sr. would never completely recover from the effects of persecution and exposure. Don Carlos writes to Joseph and Hiram as soon as he is able. Quincy, Illinois, March 1839, March 6th. Emma and children are well. They live 3 miles from here and have tolerable good health. Hiram's children and Mother Grinolds, this is Hannah Grinolds, are living at present with Father. They are all well. Mary Fielding Smith has not got her health yet, but I think it increases slowly. Don Carlos talks of his health being bad as well because of the exposure, so he fell ill as well. This leaves Joseph and Hiram Smith in jail with their families now far away from them. Throughout the next few months, they would experience exposure to the cold Missouri winter, taunting from outsiders, scant food that Hiram described as not being fit for animals. Sometimes they were poisoned, and one time Hiram said that they were given food that he was warned by the Spirit not to eat, for it was human flesh. They had few letters from their families due to the extreme suffering they were undergoing during the Exodus, which brings me to another side story. And this is about Hiram. And so when I talk about the little-known things about history, I love finding those out because that tells you the heart stories. And this is about Hiram Smith and not seeing any letters from Mary, his wife. And so Joseph and Hiram were in jail. They had spent time preparing several writs of habeas corpus in hopes that Judge King had softened his aggressive feelings toward them, or at least some of the justices of the Supreme Court. On March 15th, Hiram signed a petition to be carried to the Supreme Court of Missouri with an accounting of the losses of their families had suffered at the hands of cruelty. He also wrote in his journal, "Those who call to see us as they would an elephant," as if he and his comrades were oddities on display. He's very lonely in the jail. He wants to hear from his wife. Except for the small morsels of news that comes from visitors, they're not getting any information at all. At length they will hear the family has arrived in Missouri safely, but they will not completely know of the treacherous details until they rejoin their families in Illinois. So Hiram writes to Mary, March 16, 1836, "My dear companion, how you prosper I do not know. I again once more sit down to write a few lines to you of our circumstances at present. Brother Ripley and Brother Heber C. Kimball were here yesterday, and we have sent them to the judges of the Supreme Court of the state with a petition with a writ of habeas corpus. We expect them to be back in 10 days. The people here seem to be friendly. They all seem to think the Supreme Judge will set us free, and the spirit of the people seems to be in our favor. We've done all we can do to make our escape from this prison and not to endanger our lives. There are a few religious bigots that are kept to guard us, and they are willing to shoot a man. They'll shoot us if they could get a chance, and we have to be very careful what we do." They conclude at this point to start devising a means of escape. The last exertion we made, some friend put some augers into the window and an iron bar. We made a hole in through the logs in the lower room and through the stone. At this time, Hiram knows very little about Mary's ill health and that she remained sick after the birth of their son. So he wrote endless letters to her and didn't receive anything back. He finally gets word of his family in March of 19th, 1839, from David Rogers, who has been to see her. He reports that she has been very ill but is getting better. Still, he has not had a letter from Mary. His anxiousness grew as they awaited their time before Judge Austin King. Brother Rogers had seen Mary before traveling to Liberty, carrying information and letters. He is wounded. Hiram is wounded that she did not write him because of the lack of communication from her. He was beginning to feel as if she had turned from him. Now you can imagine, they're in this jail, it's freezing cold, they're in there for months, he's heard nothing, and he's starting to have these feelings that she doesn't love him anymore, she's had too much, she can't deal with it anymore, where are his children, what's happening. Hiram hastily penned a letter on the only scrap of paper he could find, noting his poor health and his anxiousness to hear from her as soon as possible. Quote, "I was somewhat disappointed that I did not hear from you and the family by your pen." Acknowledging her frailty due to illness, he added, "Someone could write for you. I am confined and feel very anxious to hear from you. My feelings and anxiety is such that my sleep has departed from me. My faith, understanding, and judgment is not sufficient to overcome these feelings of sorrow." He also added that he wished to know the details of their journey by her own hand. "Excuse my poor writing," he continued. "My nerves are somewhat affected, and my hands this evening are quite swollen and fingers are stiff and painful with the rheumatism." This line alone gives you, we hear about they were jailed for so long, the many things that they endured during that imprisonment, but until you read from their own handwriting, the physical toil it was having on them and the emotional, it's just so sad. It's hard. And for him to be thinking that his wife doesn't love him anymore at such a time would have been so hard. On March 20th, Hiram has another chance to write and sends word that he feels their freedom will soon be upon them. By the time of his escape, it will have been 6 weeks since he had seen her in the jail. They had only been married for 15 months and spent less than a year together. This letter contained the following. "Brother Rogers informed me this morning that he called on you to inform you he was coming here, but you gave him no answer. I do not wish to sorrow up your feelings if they are innocent, but I thought it strange that you did not send one word to me when I thought you knew I was so anxious to hear from you. If you have no feelings for me as a husband, you could send your consent to be sent some information concerning the little babe or those little children that lie near my heart. Although my heart feels wounded today whilst I write, My heart is tender like that of a child's. Notwithstanding my experience, manhood, and age, the tears do obstruct my writing. But his large packet of letters had only reached her on April 10th, and she was sitting down to write him just then. So she didn't even know about the letters until April 10th, and she was sitting down to write him back, because she'd read everything he had written, and she's like, oh my goodness, I've got to get word to him. She had held back from writing because she had only been led to believe that they would have been released soon and he would miss the letter. Before that, she was too ill to write. In her letter, she expressed her sorrow that he thought she had abandoned him. I cannot bear the thought of you having any such suspicions. Surely you had not. If so, you are yet unacquainted with the principles of my heart. What? Should I forsake a friend and a bosom friend in the time of adversity and affliction, when all of the sympathy and affection I am capable of feeling is called for to soothe and comfort as far as possible under such circumstances as you are placed in? No. Reason, religion, and honor, and every feeling of my heart forbids such a thought to enter there. Mary explains that it was the first she had heard of David Rogers having been at the house and taking letters. She gives him a full report on the welfare of the family, but by the time the letters get there, they have been allowed to escape the jail, so he never gets them. And so can you imagine what he's going through and how anxious he is to get home? All the family would reunite except those who had been lost and begin anew in a town called Commerce, later named Nauvoo. When he saw her face again, he was assured of her love and concern for him. In April 1839, Joseph and Hiram, of course, were reunited with their families in Quincy. In the morning of April 22nd, Dimmick Huntington, at Emma Smith's request, went down to the river's edge to inquire about news from the west and spotted the prophet. My goodness, is it you, Brother Joseph? He raised his hand and stopped me, saying, hush, hush. Huntington said that Joseph had come by ferry boat at 8 a.m. and was dressed in an old pair of boots full of holes, pants torn, tucked inside of boots, blue cloak with collar turned up, wide-brimmed hat, rim sloped down, not being shaven for some time, looked pale and haggard. Dimmick asked if he wished to see his father and mother, but Joseph wanted to see Emma and the children first. When he reached the Cleveland's farm, Emma recognized him as he dismounted from his horse and met him halfway to the gate. So this has been quite the experience for them in Missouri. And I just hope that, I know I read a lot of stuff, but I just wanted to get all the information out there of what each individual family was going through, the anxiousness, the emotional pain, the anxiousness for their family when they're away or they're in hiding, and the women, what they're having to do while their husband, they're fending for themselves with the help of anybody who might be sympathetic. And sometimes that happened, but most times it didn't, and they had to rely on one another. And those Smith women embraced the Latter-day Saint women with all their hearts and lifted them up during this time. I just want to say a little bit about Don Carlos, because he did fall ill. I'll be doing a whole segment on Don Carlos. He's an amazing man. But he went on to become the editor of the Times and Seasons in Nauvoo. He had said, since the world was flooded with literary and religious trash, it was important for the church to distribute the truth. And so he decided he wanted to do that. But he writes Joseph, while they were still in Liberty, Joseph received a letter that he had fallen ill. He felt that it started with a toothache, and it just kind of went through all his body. And it's possible that his illness weakened his immune system, for he struggled with ill health for the next 2 years. After moving to Nauvoo, Don Carlos became industrious in the printing in the Times and Season. On August 7th, 1841, Don Carlos Smith passes away of respiratory illness, so he's only there for a couple of years before he dies. His death hit both Joseph and Emma hard. In Joseph's writings, He makes clear the devotion that he feels toward his younger brother. Emma was particularly close to Don Carlos and had known him since he was 9 years old. Joseph and Emma loved Don Carlos so much that they named their new baby after him. Sadly, 8 days after the death of Joseph's brother Don, he and Emma would suffer the loss of their infant son, Don Carlos. It could not have helped matters that the Times and Seasons office where he worked was located in the bottom level of a building that was damp all of the time. He was 25 years old, 25, and I look at everything that he did before he died. He did things that people don't even do in a lifetime. By the time one reads all that this young man had done between 1837 and 1841, they would have thought the age of death should have read 85 or something to the like. His obituary says that he endeared to the church and his friends by all that was virtuous, honorable, and exalted in a Christian and a man. To his partner and his children by all that was affectionate, kind, and lovely, and a parent and father. To his aged mother, who yet survives her youngest son, by all that was dutiful and affectionate, and a son. In all of our associations with mankind, we never knew an individual who stood higher in the estimation of all than did the deceased. Don Carlos Smith stood 6 feet 4 inches tall and was described as being very well made. He had light hair and was known as strong and industrious. Emma Hale Smith said of him that he was the most handsome man she had ever known. Many who knew him thought that he exhibited many of the same characteristics in nature that they beheld in his brother Joseph. At some length, I'm going to do also something about his daughter Josephine. So it's just a little side story, but her life is fascinating. She's just a few years older when Don Carlos passes away, and her name is Josephine Donna Smith. But after the martyrdom, her mother falls in love with someone who works in newspapers in St. Louis, and they make their home there, and eventually they go out west. Because of the persecution that happened in the family, her stepfather asked Agnes never to mention to anybody that she was ever affiliated with the Mormons or married to a Mormon, so that they wouldn't have to face persecution. So Josephine develops a love for writing poetry, and she changes her name to Ina Coolbrith because she fears that Josephine Donna Smith would link her to Joseph Smith, and so that fear was inbred in her very early. She would go on to become the first poet laureate of California, a mentor to Jack London, and a very good friend and confidant to Mark Twain. And so I look forward to discussing her life. I remember one of her, I think it was in one of her journals, she wrote that her cousins, Alexander Hale Smith, my great-grandfather, and his brother Joseph came to visit when they were doing missions in California for the Reorganized Church. And she said she was so glad to see them because she had not got to meet very many of the cousins from the Smith family. And she loved them so much, but while they were there, she begged them not to tell anyone they were related. And she was sorry for that later because she so wanted to know her father. But it just gives you an idea of the fear that was kind of pressed into our family, even into my generation. I'll talk about that another time. But I just I want to thank you for giving me some time to talk about this particular episode in our family. And if you have any questions, I'd be glad to answer any. It doesn't even have to be about Missouri. It can be about anything with the Smith family, if you have any questions.
So I was just wondering, that date that you said that Hiram Smith's wife came to see him in Bell, when was that again?
Oh, my.
You said January.
It was January of 1838, or 1839. Yeah. Yeah, January. I want to bear you my testimony that I know this gospel is true. I'm very grateful for for the heritage that I have and share with so many of you. I was telling somebody this earlier that we as Smith descendants, we don't think we're more special than others because we come from that line. Because Joseph couldn't have done what he did without those other pioneers. It took a team of individuals working together as a family, and that's how our Heavenly Father wants us today, working together as a family. I leave that with you in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.